Welcome to the Teaching Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. Thank you for watching and sharing with your family and friends. And remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons at the end of this video. In this episode, we're going to look at part 2 of college football realignment with promotion and relegation. In this episode, we're going to look at how the schedule would be set up in the initial season and the following seasons. We're going to look at how the playoffs would be set up, including bowl games for all 4 levels, the FBS, the FCS, Division I and 1AA. We're going to look at some bowl games for FBS teams that do not qualify for the playoffs. We're going to look at some special bowl games, and we're going to look at how television and the major networks are tied into this. In our previous episode, College Football Realignment, Promotion, and Relegation, Part 1, we broke college football down into 8 regions. Each region had 4 tiers, FBS, FCS, Division I, and Division I AA. Each of these tiers, in a sense, were their own conferences. If you won your conference, you were promoted or moved up. If you finished last in your conference, you could be relegated or moved down. And we talked about how the NIL money would be tied to that promotion and relegation. And you can check that out in Part 1 of the episode. In this episode, we're going to look at the schedule. One of the reasons that we're going to adjust the schedule for college football is because of how long the season has gotten and how transfer rules and coaching changes have affected football. We talked about this in our episode on how college football is broken, how coaches are leaving and players are leaving, and the season ends around the end of November for the regular season for teams, but some teams don't play their bowl games till early January. And in that time, coaches leave, players transfer, and the team that ends up playing in a bowl game does not resemble the team that played in the regular season. So with changing the college football schedule, adjusting the playoffs and the bowl games, we're trying to get the season to end in early January. This would be a benefit to coaches who could not leave their schools until the national championship game is finished. Then when it's done in early January, they can go to their new school. This will give them time to evaluate the players they have, see which players may be potentially transferring from their new school or the players available in the transfer portal. And this will give the coaches time to do a little bit of recruiting before National Signing Day of high school players in early February. For the players, if we finish the season in early January, this would give them time to decide whether or not they wanted to enter the transfer portal or potentially decide whether or not they wanted to submit their names for the NFL draft, which players have to do by mid-January. So there's a lot going on at the end of the college football season. And with the national championship game getting pushed farther and farther back into mid-January, near the same time when the NFL requires underclassmen who still potentially could play college to submit their names to potentially be drafted, there is a big change there, and there isn't enough time for players to make necessarily an informed decision. So we're trying to help them and give them more time. So to make these changes, we would limit college football to an 11-game regular season with 1 bye week for each team. We would start with 4 non-conference games of teams at the same level. So teams at the FBS level would only play other teams from the FBS level. They could not schedule an FCS team or a team in Division I. Then teams would play their 7 conference games. So we'd have 11 games with a bye week. And the bye week would happen for all teams between weeks 5 and week 8. So teams would play their 4 non-conference games and then potentially have their bye week in week 5, 6, 7, or 8. And since we have 8 teams, we could have 2 teams on bye week each week. To balance that out, all teams would have their bye weeks completed by week 8. So weeks 9, 10, and 11, all teams would be playing every week, which would help give us a better idea as to how things would fall with playoff scenarios and conference championships. To better understand how this would work, we're going to take a sample region. We're going to look at the North region, and we're going to break down their schedule, how we would do the schedule, how we would potentially have promotion and relegation. So begin with the North region. We have Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Minnesota, Ohio State, and Wisconsin. This would be the FBS level. In our initial season change, going with 11 games, we would start by having teams play their opponents at the same alphabetical level across the board. So for example, Illinois is the first team listed in this conference. They would play 2 home games and 2 road games against non-conference opponents. I picked 2 at random, one being the Southeast and one being the West. These would be Illinois' 2 potential home games. They would play Alabama and Arizona because those are the first 2 teams in those regions alphabetically. There are 2 road games. I randomly picked the Mountain region and the Northeast region, which the first teams alphabetically would be BYU and Boston College. So these would be Illinois' 4 opponents for the first 4 weeks. Then at some point between weeks 5 and 8, they would have their bye week. On the weeks when they don't have their bye, they would be playing Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Minnesota, Ohio State, and Wisconsin for determining who would win the conference. The last week of the season would be Thanksgiving weekend, and that would be potential rivalry week. So for example, Michigan and Ohio State, when they play the game, that's when they would play. Alabama and Auburn would play the Iron Bowl that week. And we would reserve that last week for the big rivalry games. Now, some teams may lose a rival with the new alignment that you can see in our previous episode. But this is a chance for teams to potentially get new rivals or to maybe have a long-standing success. Let's say Minnesota and Iowa play each other last week of the season. In that rivalry game, Minnesota wins. Let's say Iowa gets relegated down a couple levels or down a level to the FCS level. Before they would play each other again, Minnesota would have bragging rights maybe for a couple of years. Depends on if Iowa could move back up. But that's how that would go for the FBS level. Now, looking at the FCS level, Central Michigan being the first team alphabetically in this conference. Their opponents would also be from the Southeast and the West for the home games, and the Mountain region and the Northeast for their road games. So Central Michigan would get Central Florida and Boise State for their home games, and Air Force and Army for their road games. Looking at the Division I level, looking at Akron, first team alphabetically, they would play in the Southeast, Alabama A&M, and in the West, Eastern Washington. Those would be their 2 home games. Akron's road games would be Augustana of South Dakota and Buffalo from the Northeast. Eastern Illinois, being the 1AA region, they would host Alabama State and Cal Poly. And then their road games, they would go to Adams State of Colorado, which would be the Mountain region, and then Albany in the Northeast region. And as we said in part 1 of this episode, we had to make some adjustments for some schools, bring some, in a sense, Division II schools up to that Division I AA level to fill out the Western states. So with this being done, with the FBS, FCS, Division I and Division I AA schedules working out after that first season, then we can make adjustments and make changes. So for example, this past season of the schools listed here, Michigan State was the lowest ranked team in the Big Ten. They would move down a level, move down to the FCS level. Let's say Northwestern won the FCS conference title at their region. They would move up. Say Northern Illinois finished last at the FCS level. They would move down to the Division I level. And let's say Toledo won the Division I conference, their conference there. They would move up. Northwestern then, being the last seeded team, basically being the number 8 team in the FBS level, they would face other number 8 seeds at the FBS level in the other conferences in the following season's schedule. So we'd make adjustments that way with the schedules to try to get a balance of good teams playing week in, week out, middle of the pack teams playing each other week in and week out, and lower teams, non-conference games playing each other week in and week out. Once we've gotten through the season, we have the 4 different levels. We have their various bowl games and postseason. What I'm proposing for the postseason is at each level, you have your 8 conference champions. Those conference champions make the playoffs, and they would host first round games. The remaining 8 teams would be coming from wildcard teams. They would be determined by the same type of metrics that the NFL uses. We talked about that in a couple of different episodes also. But using those metrics, we could determine not only the 8 conference champions, their seeding, who's number 1 overall, but also the 8 wildcard teams and where they would go to play. So in a sense, team number 16 would go play team number 1, the overall number 1 seed and conference champion. Following that first round of games, going to the quarterfinals, now we start getting into the bowl games. And right now we're going to start with the Division 1 AA bowl games. Teams would move on to these 6 bowl games on a rotating basis. 4 games for the quarterfinals, 2 bowl games for the semifinals, and then the national championship game at a predetermined site. So for Division 1 AA, we went with some smaller bowls, the 68 Ventures Bowl in Mobile, Alabama, the Birmingham Bowl, the Cactus Bowl in Tempe, the Cure Bowl, the Gasparilla Bowl, and the Myrtle Beach Bowl. So for this example, the first 4 bowls, 68 Ventures, Birmingham, Cactus, and Cure, they would be the quarterfinals rounds. The winners would go play in the semifinals at the Gasparilla Bowl and the Myrtle Beach Bowl, and then the winners of those games would go on to the national championship. At the Division 1 level, we have these bowl games: Boca Raton, the Independence, Las Vegas, Liberty, Music City, and New Mexico. In these bowl games, let's have the bottom 4 this time be the quarterfinal games. Just for example, Las Vegas, the Liberty Bowl, which is in Memphis, Music City Bowl, which is in Nashville, and the New Mexico Bowl. Winners of those 2 games would go to the Independence in Shreveport, Louisiana, the Boca Raton Bowl, and then those teams would go on again to the national championship. At the FCS level, now we're getting into some bigger bowl games: the Alamo, Citrus, Gator, Holiday, ReliaQuest, and Sun Bowl. These are some mid-level college football games. The Alamo's kind of a little bit more towards the upper end, but not quite at the highest level. But these also would be quarterfinal, semifinal games for the FCS, with the winners eventually going on to the national championship. Before we get to the FBS level, let's look at some special bowl games. I have complete respect for our military, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and I think that these 3 teams should go to a bowl game no matter what their record. If Air Force finishes 2-9, that's fine. They can go on to a bowl game. So I'm proposing that we have 3 military games for the military teams: Armed Forces Bowl, the Military Bowl, and the Salute to Veterans Bowl. For the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, they each would be one of the 3 teams, or one of the teams in these games. They would play an opponent who did not qualify for the playoffs in one of these games as their opponent. If, for example, let's say Army makes the playoffs at their level, in this case right now they're at the FCS level. If Army would make the playoffs, then 2 teams would be selected to play in the Military Bowl, since Army is obviously not going to be available. But this is just a way to show respect to our military, to give them a chance to end the season with a bowl game win. Since these players end up going serving our country, potentially sacrificing their lives so we can enjoy the freedoms that we have, going to these bowl games, cheering for the teams that we love and enjoy watching, I think we need to show some respect to the military servicemen that participate in football and give them a fair chance at, if not a national championship, at least a bowl game win. Moving on to the FBS level. We're going to keep the same Big 6 games that they have right now in the rotation: the Orange Bowl, Peach Bowl, Sugar Bowl, Cotton Bowl, Fiesta, and Rose Bowls. Again, these would be broken down in a sense like they are right now: 4 games for these bowls, getting the quarterfinals, 2 getting semifinals, and 1 getting the national championship. For the FBS teams that don't make the playoffs, let's give them a bit of a reward and a bit of a benefit for playing at a higher level, for playing at the FBS level. So the teams that don't make the playoffs, they can participate in the Arizona, Hawaii, Mayo, Pop-Tart, Potato, and Texas Bowls. We've reduced the number of bowls and we spread them out through the 4 levels because I believe college football has just gotten to the point where there are way too many bowl games. And do teams really want to go to New York to play in the Pinstripe Bowl in January, or the Fenway Bowl to play in Boston in January? I don't think that they should. I like warmer weather as basically a reward, potentially nice weather. Yes, it can rain. Yes, there can be storms that would affect the bowl games. But for the most part, it's generally nicer weather at the end of December for these bowl games. One exception is a Potato Bowl that is played at Boise State on the blue turf, which I think is a great look. So I'm keeping that bowl in. Now, once we have these bowls, how do we get them broadcast? How do the television networks tie in? We're going to treat the television networks in the same way, kind of like the bowls. ABC and ESPN would get the postseason games for that level. All the postseason games, all the bowl games, and the national championship. The FCS level would go to CBS, Division I would be Fox, and Division I AA would be NBC. Again, I did these in alphabetical order. But we would rotate these divisions the same way the networks rotate the Super Bowl. The following season, we could move ABC, ESPN up. They would move up, so they would be the 1AA. NBC would be Division 1. Fox would be FCS. CBS would be the FBS. Following year, we'd move them up again, and it would be on a rotating basis. So that way, no one network would get just the FBS games and would just, in a sense, control the bowl games that way. But I think this is a good way to spread out the college football playoffs, get these lower tier teams on some of these networks, get the playoff games all the way through broadcast, and get some exposure to some of these smaller schools like a Buffalo, like an Adams State from Colorado, like an Augustana from South Dakota. Let's give those schools a little bit of love. Let their players play in front of a TV audience that could have eventually national implications if they make it all the way to a national championship game. And let's let them have their moment in the sun just like Ohio State and Michigan and Texas do. Even though those bigger schools at the FBS level get all of their regular season games played out every week on the major network stations, as we mentioned in part 1, with all the different levels of ABC and ESPN and CBS and their sports networks, Fox and their sport networks, and NBC and the Peacock system, we could have a lot of games played, a lot of them on TV, and once we get to the playoffs, let's broadcast all those games to the benefit of the players in those schools. So this is just some of my thoughts on college football realignment, promotion and relegation, how the playoffs and the bowl games would be set up, and just making an adjustment and make things a little bit more logical as compared to what college football has become today. Don't forget to check out part 1 of this video and also the episode of how college football is broken, which also ties into this. This has been the Teaching Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. Thank you for watching and sharing with your family and friends. Don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and we'll see you on our next episode.